My name is Shaw Selby. I run an organization called FieldKit, and I'm going to be telling you about work that we've been doing for the last couple of years in the Amazon. So FieldKit is, we're kind of a weird organization in that we're a nonprofit, but we're also an engineering organization. So our mission is really to change the way that we do environmental sensing in the world. This came from the fact that a lot of times sensors are not useful in the situations that plenty of us are in because they're expensive, they're difficult to use, it's hard to bring other data points together. And so the mission behind FieldKit was how do we create these tools in a way that is much more plug and play, very modular, lower price points, all those sorts of things. It makes data sharing much more easy. So we do that through two sorts of ways, and I'm giving you a little context here before I get into the Amazon project. But the first way is by doing the technology development, doing the engineering and the manufacturing of these tools. But the second way is around capacity building. So, just getting the technology to these places, as we all know, is not the final answer. There's still a lot that needs to be done once these tools are out in the field. And so we have this program called Field Schools, which I'll talk a little bit about because it's a big part of the work that we do in the Amazon. So FieldKit, the hardware side of it is, you can, if you want, we're in the exhibitor hall, so you can come by and talk to me in more detail about it, so I won't go into too much detail here. But it's sensors and a data logger that measures things like water quality, chemistry, water chemistry information, meteorological weather stuff, water level flooding sort of data, and a bunch of different other things. And then, so we try and make it a way where you can mix, match, and choose whatever you want. And then there's an app that allows you to kind of configure and download the data, change settings and all that, calibrate sensors, things like that. And then a data visualization platform. I will say that the data visualization platform is something that is free to use for anyone who wants to use it. But also, if you would rather that data go into something like EarthRanger or whatever other data visualization platform is something that you prefer, we try and make those mechanisms happen as easily as possible. We don't have any, we just want to build the tools that allows all of you, all the people in the field, to do their job better. And the last thing I'll quickly say is that we configured FieldKit in a way where you can very easily pick which part of it you want to use. So there's some people who just use our data visualization platform, and there's other folks who just use our sensors and send that data other places. But part of the big part of that as a nonprofit and as an organization that builds all of this stuff open source is there's a lot of documentation and education that goes around it. So we have a lot of that information online. One thing that we found in working with in different places is a lot of times people want their documentation in different sorts of ways. So instead of a big write-up, they'd rather have a bunch of small instructional videos. So we work a lot around what that might look like. So in 2018, we started working with WCS and a bunch of other partners on this project that was called Citizen Science for the Amazon. It took place across multiple countries in the Amazon. It was bringing together a lot of groups that were interested in monitoring things like water quality and fisheries information that was happening in the region and sharing amongst other groups together. And that's actually one of the areas where we got started in this specific, what the current iteration of FieldKit is. So we did a bunch of prototyping and work with folks to build new types of sensors that they could go and deploy in the Amazon. And at first, the first thing we did was we sent these sensors down or took these sensors down into all the partner organizations, and they went off and tried to deploy them. We found that that wasn't really a successful way to do that project, and so we implemented what we call field schools, which is really this idea that this capacity building idea that happens around the environmental sensing thing, and how can you train the folks who are using those tools to understand the technology a little bit better, understand environmental monitoring better, and how environmental data can help you answer the questions that you might have about the conservation work that you do or the way that your environment's changing in real time. And this included working with the hardware. It included going out into the field and doing real-time development or deployments of stuff and understanding those parameters, and also how do you deploy something in the way that makes sure that you have the best data quality and that the sensor isn't going to be damaged things and stuff in the field. And then we worked with these communities and these members that were part of this larger project, and they went off and deployed their sensors. And again, we found that a lot of times those sensors went off and didn't maybe get the data quality that they wanted, or they weren't deployed in the right way, and there was a lot of sort of this kind of uncertainty in some of these areas because they had not worked with, water quality sensors before and stuff like that. So a couple years ago, we started a sort of a more in-depth project with this community that is in the Tres Fronteras region of the Amazon, which is the intersection of where Peru, Colombia, and Brazil all meet, around monitoring that region. And this was meant to be a much more collaborative project where we were helping the community real time sort of decide what they wanted to measure, how they're going to measure it, what were the tools to do it, what's the best way to keep these projects going over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So you can see Leticia is the base that we come out of, and then I'll show a map later on that shows all the different monitoring sites and the partners that we were working with on that. So there was a bunch of different objectives that we had. One was they wanted to measure changes to the water. They wanted to measure changes to the water level, the flooding, and weather parameters. We wanted everybody involved wanted this data to be somewhat continuous so that we could start to get a baseline and understand things. A lot of the folks in the region that had these sorts of tools, they were using sensors that were much more like point source. They'd go out, they'd measure something, and then they'd come back, whereas the stuff we were building was meant to be continuously deployed. The major part of this effort was around capacity building. So we were working, I'll show the partners in a second, but we were working with schools and trying to and the communities involved and tried to talk to them a lot about the data and why that matters. And the dissemination of all that data was a huge part and is still a huge part of the work that they do there. So there was a couple of things that we really had to keep in mind around this sort of work. One of it is all the priorities of what was measured, where it was measured, how it was measured, all that stuff came from the community themselves. And so they held workshops where they talked to a lot of the folks, and they would, select these sites based off of where they were doing the most fishing or places that were upstream of the communities, and they wanted to understand how that would impact daily life in the communities. And there's a university in Leticia that had worked very closely with these towns and other community organizations to understand what makes the most sense for that sort of thing. The tools had to be sort of easy to use in a way that most of the people who are using these tools don't have a huge understanding of technology and how it works. Many of them have smartphones, but that's sort of the extent of the technology knowledge that they had. And last, it was how do we increase the capacity in there? That's the main goal behind this sort of stuff. The partners that we had, and this was quite an interesting group of people to pull together because a lot of times often they weren't really talking to each other. So we had the National University of Colombia that was leading the scientific side of things. And that was alongside Florida International University. So Florida International University was part of the WCS project earlier that I mentioned. They had continued to do work in that region, and they had, I'll mention it later, but they had a complementary project that really helped with the success of this one. There were a couple of nonprofits that were involved in the monitoring process, FieldKit itself, OMACHA, and then there was a fisheries cooperative that was doing it. The National Parks of Colombia was involved. And then we also had a bunch of, lodges and local reserves that were interested in monitoring at their sites as well. So these are all the different communities that we've monitored in. This list has changed sort of over time since it is truly community-based monitoring. If a community is no longer interested in measuring that stuff, then that's not a problem and that site disappears. But also new sites come on all the time. So it's this sort of living, breathing, monitoring entity, and how those different communities and organizations work with each other, which I'll talk about in a second, really directs how they want to do that. So typically we have made this commitment as FieldKit to offer very high level of support to this project because we believe in it and the work that they're doing. And so we do go down quite a bit to visit these sites and work with the community monitors, the technical monitor, and some of the other folks, and visit all the things. I'm actually, right after this trip, I'm going down to Leticia to do exactly that work. And there's like a big research component to this as well, right? So we, the ownership of the project, or part of the project at the National University of Columbia, means that they're looking at a lot of the research that has been done in the region, and how does that correspond back to the stuff that we're doing here. The expectations of the local communities and the indigenous folks that are working there are really shaping the direction of how this monitoring network works. And I think one of the things we benefited from was a good, consistent support from funders throughout the process, as we've sort of been able to maintain this thing moving forward. And different parts of it we've presented at a bunch of different scientific conferences over the year. This sort of model of how we are looking at doing community monitoring in this region. And then the big part of it is sort of the outreach work that we do in the area as well. So one is like the local capacity building. This is very important. So the way that it works is each one of the monitoring sites has a local monitor. That's somebody from that community who's eager and excited to do this sort of work and learn more about this work. And those roles change from time to time, but they're really, when everyone comes together and talks about the data, they're like the advocate for their organization or their community. We also have the second level that here it's listed as a super technician, and that's somebody who is actually it's hired from the university to act as like the glue between all those local monitors, and that has been a really incredible role. We've actually had 3 different people come through that role, and they learned so much that they ended up usually going off and getting a job at like a research station or something like that. So it's been this launching off point for their careers, which has been pretty awesome as well. And a lot of those local monitors, they're learning about how to maintain these things, how to calibrate these things, and why they matter to the things of their local, of everybody around them. So it's really interesting. And then there's regular meetings. There's monthly meetings that happen where they share the data, they all look at it and try and understand, and then they take all that information and they will create handouts or little posters. They have a local designer that takes it and does like some great things where they can kind of explore and learn more about that data. And so lastly, this is, a lot of the lessons learned that we've had is, one is funding is so super critical to this kind of work, and that the capacity building that you do has to be adaptive, because you learn a lot, and you really have to help any way that you can. The bridging of the academic science and the traditional knowledge, like we heard earlier, has been critical, and that really happens within the sort of communities in the university as they decide where they want to measure these sorts of things. There's still lots of barriers with this, but I think we've done a good job at mitigating a lot of them by making sure that everybody in all those different communities, organizations, and they're there every part of the way as they're going through the whole thing. I think what we would like to see is this system grow out more. We're very interested to kind of support that sort of work, and like find better ways to take that data and maybe have a larger impact with it outside of just the decisions of the communities. But it's been great at strengthening partnerships locally. A lot of, as I said in the beginning, a lot of these organizations, they didn't really talk to each other or work with each other prior to this, and now they're having monthly meetings and they're having these really these great outcomes as a result of it. And it's nice to have this sort of sustained baseline data that's deployed in these places, instead of just a piecemeal sort of understanding of the environmental parameters as they change over time. Lastly, I just want to thank all the the local and indigenous communities that we work with, and the organizations that have welcomed FieldKit and us into their world to do this sort of work. So, thank you.